The rain started an hour before Davin found them. It came in sideways, driven by a wind that had been building since dusk, turning the border road into a rutted stream of brown water and loose gravel. Davin's mare plodded through it with the resigned patience of an animal that had long ago concluded that humans made poor decisions about travel schedules, and that protesting the fact was a waste of energy. Davin was tired. The kind of tired that accumulates over a 14-hour day of bending iron, shaping wood, and explaining to customers that no, a wheel hub cannot be repaired with rope. And optimism, and yes, the repair will cost more than they want to pay, and no, he will not reduce the price, because the alternative is a wheel that falls off at speed and converts their cargo into a roadside donation. He was the only wheelwright in the border town of Ashford, also the only blacksmith, also the only person within 15 miles who could look at a broken axle and tell you whether it needed replacing or resetting, and who owned the tools to do either. This made him essential, which in a border town meant overworked, underpaid, and the recipient of a steady stream of complaints about turnaround times from people who had no concept of what a one-man operation entailed. He was 33. He had a 6-year-old daughter named Fern, who was currently at home with Mrs. Calloway, the elderly neighbor who watched her on the nights Davin worked late. In exchange for free gate hinges and the unspoken understanding that loneliness was a currency that could be traded for company. He had a workshop at the edge of town that smelled of iron filings, horse sweat, and the specific chemical scent of quenching oil. He had a dead wife named Alora who had died of the wasting sickness 2 years ago and whose absence was a room in his house that he kept closed and never entered and never stopped knowing was there. The road was empty. It was always empty at this hour. Too late for merchants, too early for the dawn patrols. The specific window of darkness that belonged to nobody and that Davin occupied twice a week on the nights he worked past closing because a job needed finishing and the job did not care about the clock. He saw the cart from 200 yards. It was stopped at an angle on the shoulder, listing to the left where the rear wheel had come loose. An orc-built cargo wagon, heavier than the human models, wider axle base, the bed constructed from the dense hardwood that orc craftsmen preferred. A canvas tarp covered the cargo, lashed down against the rain. The wheel wasn't off, but it was wrong, tilted inward at an angle that meant the mounting pin had failed, and the wheel was being held in place by friction and gravity and not much else. 2 figures stood beside it, both orc, both female, both soaked. The first one was under the wagon, on her back in the mud, working at the wheel assembly with a tool Davin couldn't identify from this distance. Her legs extended from beneath the chassis, and the mud had coated her trousers to the thighs. She was cursing, not in common, in Orcish, a rapid stream of guttural syllables that Davin's limited knowledge of the language could not translate, but whose emotional content required no translation at all. The second one was standing on the road waving, not at Davin specifically, at the road in general, at the principle of traffic, at the idea that someone might eventually pass and might eventually stop. Her arm rose and fell with the mechanical repetition of a person who had been waving for a long time and had downgraded the gesture from hopeful to habitual. Davin pulled the mare to a stop. The waving stopped. The orc woman on the road looked at him with the specific assessment that orc women applied to human men who appeared unexpectedly on dark roads, measuring threat level, escape routes, and the probability of violence, in that order. "Evening," Davin said. He stayed on the cart. He kept his hands visible. "Trouble with the wheel?" "We're fine," the woman on the road said. Her comment was fluent, accented, delivered at a volume designed to carry over the rain and the wind, and the implicit suggestion that assistance was not required. From under the wagon, a muffled voice. "We are not fine. The pin is sheared and I can't get the housing open with this tool and my back is in 4 inches of mud and I would like to go home. My friend is frustrated," the woman on the road said. I gathered. "Are you going to rob us?" "No." "Assault us?" "No." "Then why did you stop?" "Because I'm a wheelwright and your wheel is about to come off." Silence from the road. A beat of recalibration. The particular pause that occurs when information arrives that doesn't fit the expected category. "You're a wheelwright," the road woman repeated. "Only one in Ashford." Ashford's wheelwright stops on a dark road in the rain to help 2 orc women. Ashford's wheelwright stops when he sees a broken wheel. Species is not part of the diagnostic. The woman under the wagon slid out. She stood up, mud-covered from shoulder to boot, rain plastering her short black hair to her skull, her green skin glistening in the dim light of Davin's cart lantern. She was tall, nearly 6 feet, with the athletic build of someone who spent her days handling cargo and her evenings not sitting still. Her amber eyes evaluated Davin with a professional directness that contained no warmth and no hostility, the neutral assessment of a person deciding whether a stranger's competence was worth the risk of his proximity. Soraya, she said, not a greeting, an identification. Davin. The pin is sheared, Davin. I've been trying to extract the housing, but my tool doesn't have the right angle. Let me look. He climbed down from the cart, took his tool bag from the back, and walked to the listing wheel. He knelt in the mud, the cold, gritty, brown water soaking immediately through his trousers, and examined the assembly by lantern light. Soraya was right about the pin. It had sheared clean, the metal fracture bright against the dark housing. But she was wrong about the cause. Your housing isn't stuck, he said. It's not metal, it's bone. He ran his fingers over the joint. The wagon's mounting system was Orc standard, bone pins rather than iron rivets, set into hardwood housings with a joinery technique that human wheelwrights didn't use. His iron extraction tool, designed for metal fasteners, couldn't grip the bone pin surface. The materials were incompatible. His tools didn't speak the wagon's language. I need an Orc tool, he said. Bone chisel or a horn lever, something that can grip the pin without cracking it. Soraya looked at him. The assessment in her eyes shifted, a professional recognizing professional knowledge in unexpected packaging. She walked to the cargo bed, unlatched a side panel, and produced a leather roll of tools. She unrolled it on the wet ground and selected a short-handled implement, a bone chisel, the blade carved from elk antler, the handle wrapped in dark leather. This was my father's, she said, handing it to Davin. He built this wagon. Davin took the chisel. It felt different from his iron tools, lighter with a flex in the blade that iron didn't have. He positioned it against the broken pin, tested the angle, and nodded. I'll need you to hold the wheel housing steady while I extract the pin. Can you do that? I've been holding this wagon together for 3 years. I can hold the housing. Good. On 3. They worked together in the rain. Davin braced the chisel against the sheared pin and struck it with measured taps of his hammer. Soraya held the housing with both hands, her grip steady against the vibration, her feet planted wide in the mud. The bone chisel bit into the bone pin with a precision that Davin's iron tools could not have achieved. The materials were the same species, and they cooperated the way like substances cooperate, through shared molecular memory. The pin extracted on the 7th tap. Davin caught it before it fell into the mud, examined it, and reached into his tool bag for a replacement. I don't have a bone pin, he said. I have iron. It'll hold for the road, but you'll want to get a proper replacement. Iron in a bone housing? Temporary. It'll seat, but the expansion rates are different. In a month, the housing will crack. You know this from experience? I know this from material science. Iron and bone don't age the same way. Soraya looked at him, a long look, the kind that takes in more than the face, that reads the posture and the hands and the way a person holds a tool and the specific, irreducible quality of someone who knows what they're doing and doesn't require validation for doing it. Who built this wagon? Davin asked, seating the temporary pin. My father. He was a wagon maker in our clan before the war. He died in the second campaign. The wagon is what's left. The sentence was delivered flatly, without sentiment. Orc style, the facts arranged in order and presented without the emotional packaging that humans apply to grief. But the content was not flat. A dead father. A wagon he built with his hands. A daughter carrying it through border roads and rainstorms, keeping it running with bone tools from his kit. It's good work, Davin said. The joinery is solid. Your father knew wood. Soraya's jaw tightened, not in anger, in the specific contraction that occurs when someone says something kind about a dead person you carry with you, and the kindness reaches a place you thought you'd sealed off. Wheels on, Davin said. He stood up, knees aching, mud dripping from his trousers. It'll hold till you get to wherever you're going. Get a bone pin replacement within the month. The woman on the road, who had been watching the entire procedure with the focused attention of someone memorizing the details for later retelling, stepped forward. I'm Keth, she said, Soraya's travel partner. How much do we owe you? Keth was shorter than Soraya, wider in the shoulders, with a face built for expression and a voice built for projection. Where Soraya was contained, Keth was present, taking up space deliberately, unapologetically, the way a person takes up space who has decided that invisibility is not a survival strategy she's interested in. Nothing, Davin said. Soraya's head turned. A human doesn't fix an orc wagon in the rain for free. A wheelwright who sees a broken wheel fixes it. That's not generosity, it's professional compulsion. Charging you for it would feel like charging someone for sneezing. That's a strange philosophy. It keeps things simple. Rain, wind, the lantern flickering on the cart. Two orc women standing in the mud beside a wagon their dead father built, looking at a human wheelwright who had appeared on a dark road and solved a problem without asking what they could pay. "We want to see you again," Keth said. Soraya's head turned sharply toward her companion. "Keth, what?" "He fixed the wagon, in the rain, without charging, and he knows the difference between bone and iron pin expansion rates." "I'm being practical. You're being practical," I said. Davin looked at Keth. He looked at Soraya, who was not looking at him, who was looking at the road, at the rain, at anything that was not the human man, who had knelt in the mud and fixed her father's wagon with her father's tools and said it was good work. "Good night," Devin said. He climbed onto his cart, clicked the mare forward, and pulled back onto the road. The rain was still falling. The wind was still pushing. The darkness closed behind him the way it always closed, completely indifferently, erasing the scene as though it had never happened, except that it had. And in the side mirror of his memory, a mirror that a wheelwright's brain couldn't help checking, the way it checked every wheel on every cart that passed, he could see Soraya standing beside the wagon, watching him leave. The rain running down her face, her amber eyes holding a quality he couldn't name and couldn't stop noticing. He noticed things. It was a professional hazard. It was, on this particular night, something else entirely. He fixed a dead man's wagon with a dead man's tools and called it good work. She watched him leave in the rain with amber eyes and the sentence she didn't say. Keth said it for her. "We want to see you again." Soraya said nothing. The nothing was louder. Subscribe to Orc Girl Meets Human to see what happens when a wheelwright can't stop noticing. And tell me your city in the comments. I want to know where this story landed. 3 days later, two orc women were standing in front of Davin's workshop. The workshop sat at the eastern edge of Ashford, where the town's last row of buildings gave way to the open ground of the borderlands. It was not an impressive structure, a timber-frame shed with a forge chimney, a covered workyard where wheels and axles hung from iron hooks, and a hand-painted sign above the door that said Davin, Wellaelln, in letters that had been repainted twice and were due for a third. The yard was cluttered with the ordered chaos of a working tradesman. Raw lumber stacked against the south wall, iron stock in bins, a grinding wheel mounted on a post, and a half-finished cart frame propped on sawhorses. Fern was sitting on the front step, drawing in the dirt with a nail. She was 6, dark-haired, small for her age, and possessed of a conversational style that alternated between profound silence and total, unfiltered broadcast. She saw the orc women before Davin did. "Papa, there are 2 green ladies." Davin came out of the forge area, wiping soot from his forearms. He stopped when he saw them. Soraya was wearing clean traveling clothes. Leather vest, linen shirt, boots that had been scraped of mud since the last time he'd seen her. Keth was wearing the same thing she'd been wearing on the road, which suggested either that she had limited wardrobe options or that she considered her road clothes suitable for all occasions. "We came to get the wagon checked," Soraya said. It was a pretext. They both knew it was a pretext. The wagon was parked at the edge of the yard, and even from the doorway, Davin could see that the temporary PIM was holding fine. It would hold fine for another 3 weeks before the expansion differential became a problem. There was no mechanical reason for this visit. "Come in," Davin said, because the alternative was acknowledging the pretext out loud, and that would have required both of them to address the actual reason, which neither of them was ready to do at the front door of his workshop with his 6-year-old daughter listening. He checked the wagon anyway, professionally, thoroughly, with the careful attention to detail that characterized everything he did, and that was, he suspected, the reason Soraya had driven 20 miles to receive a service she didn't need. He inspected the temporary pin, the housing, the axle alignment, the wheel balance. Everything was functional. "Pin's holding," he said. "You've got another 3 weeks. I'll order a bone replacement from the trade post. If you want, I want. It'll take a week to arrive. You'd need to come back." "I'll come back." Keth, who had been examining the workshop with the undisguised curiosity of a person who found human craftsmanship interesting in the same way that some people found exotic animals interesting, with fascination and mild concern, turned to Davin, My partner here is not going to say what she's thinking because she is Soraya, and Soraya would rather swallow a horseshoe than express a direct emotional sentiment. So I'll say it. Keth, Soraya said. The word was a warning, a plea, and a prediction of failure, all compressed into a single syllable. She liked you, on the road, in the rain, the way you worked on the wagon, the way you said her father's work was good. She's been thinking about it for 3 days and she won't admit it because orc pride is a real thing and it's very inconvenient. Soraya's skin darkened at the cheeks, the orc equivalent of blushing, a deepening of the green pigment that Davin had never seen before and that his brain filed under the category of things he would like to see again. I didn't come here for... Soraya started. You drove 20 miles for a pin check that takes 2 minutes. I love you, but I'm not going to pretend this is about wheels. Davin looked at Keth. He looked at Soraya, who was studying the ground with an intensity that suggested she was hoping it would open and offer her an alternative to this conversation. I'm a single father, Davin said. I have a 6-year-old. My wife died 2 years ago. My life is this workshop and that child and not much else. I'm not in a position to... Soup, Keth said. What? I'm suggesting soup. At the tavern, not marriage, not commitment, not a declaration of eternal anything. Soup. It's a meal. People eat it. Sometimes across from people they'd like to know better. Fern appeared at Davin's side, the nail still in her hand, dirt drawings apparently complete. She looked at Keth. She looked at Soraya. She examined them with the comprehensive, unfiltered assessment protocol of a 6-year-old encountering a new category of person. Your teeth stick out, she said to Soraya. Soraya looked down at the child. Yes. Does it hurt? No. Can you bite through wood? I've never tried. You should try. I bet you could. Fern turned to Davin. Papa, can they stay for lunch? The green lady has cool teeth. Soup happened. Not that day. 3 days later, at the Ashford Tavern, a low-ceilinged establishment that served adequate food and poor ale, and whose proprietor had the diplomatic skill to serve orc customers without commentary and human customers without apology. Keth had engineering commitments. She was negotiating cargo routes with a merchant in the next town, which meant the soup was Davin and Soraya, alone. Across a table built for human proportions, which meant Soraya's knees didn't fit underneath, and she sat at an angle that she managed with the practiced adaptation of a person who had spent her life fitting into spaces designed for someone else. You're a trader? Davin asked. Cargo transport. Ket and I run goods between orc clans and border settlements. Leather, iron, dried provisions. We own the wagon and 2 horses, and that's the business. You travel alone? 2 women? 2 orc women. The distinction matters. Most threats on the road are human, and most humans reconsider. Keth hits very hard. Davin almost smiled. Soraya noticed. She noticed things the way he noticed things. By habit, by professional necessity, by the specific wiring of a mind that catalogued details without conscious effort. Your wife, Soraya said. Not a question. An opening. Allora, wasting sickness. It took 8 months. He looked at his soup. Fern was 4. She remembers some things. Mostly she remembers that there used to be someone else at the table. My father, 2nd campaign. Arrow, fast at least. Soraya delivered the facts the way orcs delivered grief. In short, declarative sentences, each one placed like a stone in a wall. No decoration, no inflation. The raw material of loss, presented without narrative. The wagon, Davin said. The wagon, he built it the year I was born. It was supposed to be a gift for my naming ceremony. In orc tradition, a father built something for the child, something that lasts. The wagon was what he chose. It's still running, because I keep it running. Every joint, every pin, every board. When something breaks, I fix it with his tools. When his tools break, she paused. The sentence had arrived at a place she hadn't expected it to go. When his tools break, there's no one to make new ones. The tavern was quiet. Midday, sparse crowd, the proprietor wiping the bar with the circular, meditative motions of a man who had been wiping the same bar for 20 years and had achieved a philosophical relationship with the activity. Why did you stop that night? Soraya asked. I told you. Wheelwright's compulsion. I see a broken wheel, my hands start moving. You fix people too? Only wheels. People are more complicated. That's what you said on the road. It's still true. Soraya looked at him across the table. the specific, comprehensive look of a person who was deciding whether to invest trust in someone and was performing the final calculations before committing. Her amber eyes held a quality that Davin recognized from the road. The quality of someone standing at the edge of a decision that would be easy to walk away from and interesting to walk into. "The pin," she said. "The bone replacement? You said a week. A week. I'll come back in a week. For the pin. For the pin." They both knew it was not about the pin. They both allowed the fiction to stand, because the fiction was a bridge and the bridge was necessary, and the truth would arrive when the bridge could hold its weight. Soraya came back in a week, and the week after, and the week after that. The bone pin was installed on the first visit, 20 minutes of work that Davin stretched to 40 by checking every other joint in the wagon's undercarriage. Because he was thorough, and because Soraya was standing beside him watching his hands work, and neither of them was in a hurry to reach the part of the visit where the mechanical pretext expired and the real reason had to carry the conversation. By the third visit, the pretexts had worn through. Soraya arrived at the workshop without a wagon complaint. She sat on the bench in the yard while Davin worked, and they talked, not about wagons, about the border, about trade routes, about the specific challenges of running a business alone, his in iron and wood, hers in cargo, and distance. By the fourth visit, Fern had claimed Soraya with the territorial certainty of a child who had decided that a person belonged in her orbit and was not interested in counter-arguments. "Soraya, watch this." Fern held up a piece of leather cord that she had been knotting for an hour. The result was a tangle that bore no structural resemblance to any known binding technique. "I made a trap. What does it catch? Everything. It's an everything trap. It appears to have caught itself. That's because it's really good." Soraya untangled the cord and showed Fern an Orc cargo knot, a simple functional binding that Orc traders use to secure loads. 3 loops, a twist, a pull, the kind of knot that held weight and released clean. Fern tried it, failed, tried again, failed differently, which was progress. Tried a third time and produced something that was approximately correct in the way that a child's drawing of a house is approximately a house. Structurally wrong but emotionally accurate. "Soraya, look. I did it." Soraya looked. It was wrong. But the effort was genuine, and the enthusiasm was total, and the child was beaming with the uncontainable pride of a person who has mastered something new and requires immediate, unconditional validation. "Almost right," Soraya said. "We'll practice." Keth, who arrived at the workshop every third visit and spent her time examining Davin's tools with the frank curiosity of someone shopping for ideas, pulled Davin aside during one of Fern's knot-tying sessions. "You know what's happening, right?" "I know, and what? And is this going somewhere, or is my partner going to drive 40-mile round trip every week for the rest of her life to watch your daughter tie bad knots?" "The knots are getting better." "The knots are irrelevant, and you know it." Davin looked across the yard. Soraya was sitting on the ground, the packed earth of the workshop yard, with Fern in the crook of her arm, both of them bent over a length of cord. Soraya's large green hands guiding Fern's small pink ones through the 3-loop sequence. The size difference was considerable. The concentration was identical. Two people separated by species and generation and everything the world had placed between them, focused on the same 6 inches of leather cord. "My daughter is happy," Davin said. "She hasn't been happy like this since her mother died. And you?" Davin didn't answer. Keth didn't push. Some calculations take longer than others, and the ones worth waiting for are the ones that involve a child and a dead wife, and an Orc woman who drives 40 miles to sit in the dirt and teach a 6-year-old how to tie knots. The quiet happened in the 5th week. Soraya was in the workshop repairing a leather harness strap from her wagon. Davin was at the forge shaping a wheel rim. They were 15 feet apart, working on separate tasks, and neither of them was speaking. The silence was not empty. It was the specific populated silence of two people who have discovered that they can occupy the same space without the obligation to fill it with sound. Davin shaped iron. Soraya worked leather. The forge breathed. The hammer rang. The leather creaked as the awl passed through it. Davin had not experienced this kind of silence since Alora. His wife had been the only person he had ever known with whom silence was a shared activity rather than an uncomfortable gap. After she died, silence became solitary, the quiet of a room with one person in it, which is not silence at all, but the absence of the second voice that used to make the silence feel full. Soraya's silence was different from Alora's. It was denser, more physical, produced by a body that was larger and occupied space with a different gravity. But the quality was the same, the particular comfort of a person who does not need you to perform in order to be present. He stopped hammering. He looked at her across the workshop. She was bent over the leather, her profile lit by the forge light, her concentration complete. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The silence held. That evening, after Soraya left, Davin sat at the kitchen table while Fern ate dinner. The chair across from him, Alora's chair, which Fern had started calling the empty chair in the first year, and just the chair in the second, was empty. "Papa," Fern said through a mouthful of bread, "is Soraya your friend?" "Yes." "Is she your best friend?" "She might be. She's really good at knots, and she's tall, and her teeth are cool, and she sits with you when you're working, and she doesn't talk and you don't talk, and it's nice." Davin looked at his daughter. 6 years old, breadcrumbs on her chin, articulating with accidental precision the exact thing he had been unable to articulate for 5 weeks. "Yeah," he said, "it is nice." She drove 40 miles every week. The excuse was the wagon. Then it was the pin. Then it was the knots. Then there was no excuse at all. Just a forge, a leather strap, and a silence that didn't need filling. His daughter said it. "She sits with you and you don't talk and it's nice." If that quiet means something to you, join the Org Girl Meets Human membership. It keeps these silences alive. Super thanks if the knots got you. The gossip started in the 6th week. Small towns process information the way stomachs process food. Slowly, thoroughly, and with a pronounced sensitivity to anything foreign. The information that Ashford was currently digesting was as follows. The widower wheelwright had an orc woman visiting his workshop every week, and his 6-year-old daughter was learning orc knots and calling the visitor by her first name. The market square metabolized this in stages. Stage 1 was observation. Davin's got orc customers now. This was neutral, factual, the baseline acknowledgement that a thing was happening. Stage 2 was categorization, not customers, the same two. Every week, this was the shift from observation to pattern recognition, and pattern recognition in a border town was never neutral. Stage 3 was interpretation. A human man, 2 orc women, his daughter playing with them. What kind of arrangement is that? Stage 4 was judgment. The judgment was not spoken aloud at the market square, because small towns had learned that spoken judgments created accountability, and accountability was inconvenient. Instead, the judgment manifested in the specific, atmospheric way that small-town disapproval always manifests, in the slight pause before a greeting, in the fractional increase in the distance maintained when passing on the street, in the conversations that stopped mid-sentence when Davin entered a room and resumed, slightly altered, when he left. Davin noticed he was a man who noticed things. The pauses, the distances, the recalibrated greetings. He catalogued them the way he catalogued every piece of information his environment produced. Automatically, without drama, filed under the heading of things that existed and could not be changed by pretending they didn't. The direct confrontation came from the last direction he expected. Marta Calloway, not Mrs. Calloway, the neighbor, but Marta Calloway, Alora's mother, arrived at the workshop on a Tuesday morning. She was a thin, sharp-featured woman in her late 50s who carried herself with the specific rigidity of a person who had mistaken inflexibility for strength and had been reinforcing the error for decades. She had never liked Davin. She had tolerated him because Alora had chosen him, and Alora's judgment, while alive, had been the one authority Marta deferred to. But Alora was dead, and the authority had reverted to Marta, and Marta had been waiting for a reason to exercise it. She stood in the workshop doorway and looked at the space the way a health inspector looks at a kitchen, searching for violations. "There's talk," she said. "There's always talk. About orc women in your workshop, about Fern. Soraya is a friend. Keth is her travel partner. They visit. An orc woman visits a human man's workshop every week, sits with him, eats with his child, teaches his child orc customs." Marta's voice had the particular edge of a person who has rehearsed their argument and is delivering it from a prepared text. "My daughter's child is not going to be raised around orcs." Davin set down the file he was holding. He placed it on the workbench with the careful, deliberate motion of a man who is very aware of the distance between his emotions and his actions and is choosing to keep that distance wide. "Fern is my daughter. Fern is Alora's daughter. And Alora would not have wanted this. Alora would have wanted Fern to be happy. Alora would have wanted Fern to be normal. The word sat in the workshop like a piece of heated metal, glowing, dangerous, radiating in all directions. Normal. The word that small towns used as a weapon, deploying it against anything that didn't fit the existing shape, applying it like a mold that everything and everyone was expected to conform to. If this continues, Marta said, I'll go to the magistrate. Custody review. A child living in proximity to orc influence is grounds for concern. Grounds for concern. A magistrate will see an orc woman in a human child's daily life and draw the obvious conclusion, which is that the child's welfare is not the priority, that a lonely widower is making choices based on his own needs rather than his daughter's. Davin looked at Marta. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that the silence became uncomfortable, which was the point. He was not going to argue. Argument implied that her position had merit that needed to be countered. He was going to let the silence communicate what argument could not. Marta left. The workshop door closed behind her. The forge fire crackled. The half-finished wheel on the sawhorse reflected the orange light. Everything in the room was exactly as it had been before she arrived, and nothing was the same. Davin went to the tavern that evening. Soraya was there. She had arrived that afternoon with a cargo delivery and was staying overnight at the inn. They sat at their usual table, the one in the corner where Soraya's legs fit, and the candlelight caught the amber of her eyes. He told her. He told her about Marta, about the custody threat, about the word normal, and the specific way it had been deployed. He told her about the market gossip, and the pauses, and the distances. He told her because he owed her the truth, and the truth was that his relationship with her was producing consequences that he had been absorbing alone. And absorbing alone was no longer something he was willing to do. Soraya listened. Orc listening, complete, unbroken, without the human habit of interjecting agreement or sympathy or the small verbal acknowledgments that function as proof of attention. She listened with her whole body, her eyes on his face, her hands still on the table, and the quality of her attention was so total that it felt like a physical pressure, like being held by something you couldn't see. When he finished, she was quiet for 10 seconds. Then she said, "You want me to stop coming?" "I don't want you to stop coming. I'm telling you what happens when you come. And you're asking me to make the decision for you." "No, I'm telling you the truth and trusting you to help me figure out what to do with it." "What do you want to do with it?" "I don't know." "Then I'll make it easy." Soraya stood. The motion was controlled, precise. The same economy of movement she applied to everything, including the act of leaving. "You need to decide whether Fern is safer with me in her life or without me. I can't decide that. I'm the variable, you're the equation." She walked to the door. Keth, who had been sitting at the bar pretending not to listen, caught Davin's eye as Soraya passed. Keth's expression held no judgment, only information delivered through the specific channel of a person who loved Soraya enough to say the hard thing. "Orc women don't come back twice, Davin. This isn't an orc rule. It's a Soraya rule. She let you in once. If you close the door, she won't knock again." Keth followed Soraya out. The tavern door closed. The proprietor continued wiping the bar. The following week, the workshop was very quiet. Not the populated silence of two people sharing a space, the empty silence of one person in a room built for collaboration, working alone because the other person was gone. Davin worked. Iron, wood, wheels. The mechanical routine of a tradesman performing his function: bend, shape, quench, fit. The tasks were the same tasks he had performed before Soraya arrived in his life, and they should have felt the same, and they didn't. On Thursday, the tool shelf collapsed. It was the shelf above the secondary workbench, a heavy oak plank mounted on iron brackets, holding a dozen files, chisels, and clamps. Davin had repaired the brackets himself 3 months ago, using iron rivets and the standard mounting technique he'd used for 20 years. The repair had held until Soraya's third visit. When she had noticed the bracket wobbling and reinforced it with a bone pin from her toolkit, an orc-style fastener driven into the wood with a bone chisel, gripping the grain in a way that iron rivets couldn't match. When Soraya stopped coming, the bone pin stayed, but the iron bracket beside it, which had been compensating for its own inadequacy by leaning on the bone pin's superior grip, gradually shifted. The wood around the iron rivet loosened, the bracket tilted, the shelf held for a week on friction and the memory of structural integrity, and then, on Thursday, it didn't. The tools hit the floor with a sound that was louder than physics required, the particular crash that objects make when they represent something beyond their material composition. Davin stood in front of the fallen shelf and looked at it. The bone pin was still in the wall, embedded deep, holding its half of the bracket perfectly. The iron rivet had pulled free, leaving a ragged hole in the wood. Two fastening systems, side by side, one held, one didn't. The metaphor was so obvious that he resented it. He picked up the tools, he swept the floor, he stared at the bone pin in the wall, Soraya's pin, driven with Soraya's certainty, and he understood, with the specific clarity that comes from looking at a piece of hardware and seeing your entire emotional life reflected in its performance characteristics, that the shelf was not the only thing that couldn't hold without her. He sat on the workbench. He looked at the empty yard. He looked at Fern's knot-tying cord, draped over the fence post where she had left it. He looked at the chair where Soraya sat, the chair that was too small for her, that she occupied at an angle, that she had never complained about because orc women did not complain about spaces that weren't built for them. They simply adapted and kept working. He made a decision. It was not a dramatic decision. It did not involve a revelation or an epiphany or the sudden arrival of clarity from an external source. It was the decision of a man who had been looking at a broken shelf and a bone pin and had finally admitted to himself that the question Marta had forced him to ask, is Fern safer with Soraya or without her, had an answer, and the answer was obvious, and it had been obvious for weeks, and the only reason he hadn't acted on it was that acting on it required him to choose his daughter's happiness over his mother-in-law's approval, and that choice, once made, could not be unmade. He chose Fern. He chose the knots and the cool teeth and the quiet and the orc woman who drove 40 miles every week to sit in the dirt and teach a 6-year-old how to tie cargo bindings. He closed the workshop. He saddled the mare. He rode toward the orc trade camp on the eastern road where Soraya would be loading cargo for the morning run, and he did not know whether she would see him. And Keth had said she wouldn't come back twice, and the road was long and the night was cold, and the bone pin was still in his wall, and the shelf was still on the floor. And none of that mattered because the decision had been made and the decision was right. The shelf fell. The iron rivet failed. The bone pin held. He stared at it for an hour and then he saddled the mare. Keth said, "Orc women don't come back twice." He rode anyway. If that ride means something to you, hit like. Subscribe to Orc Girl Meets Human for the next step. It matters. The orc trade camp sat 4 miles east of Ashford on a flat clearing beside the river crossing. It was a functional place, a dozen wagons arranged in a loose semicircle, cargo tarps strung between posts, horses picketed along the water's edge. The camp existed because the border towns needed orc goods and the orc traders needed border markets. And the arrangement, while not warm, was functional in the way that transactions are functional. Value exchanged, needs met. No one pretending it was friendship. Davin arrived at the camp perimeter as the last light was leaving the sky. The western horizon held a thin band of orange, and the river reflected it in broken patterns that shifted with the current. 2 orc traders were securing a load on a wagon near the entrance. They looked at Davin, a human man on horseback, alone, at dusk, and performed the rapid categorization that orc traders applied to unexpected visitors. "Looking for someone?" one of them asked. "Soraya, cargo transport?" "Third wagon from the river." "She's loading." He dismounted and walked through the camp. The orc traders watched him pass without interference. A human in an orc camp was unusual but not unprecedented, and his body language communicated purpose rather than threat. He walked past loaded wagons, past the cooking fire where a woman was stirring a pot of something that smelled of wild garlic and bone broth, past a boy brushing a draft horse with the slow, meditative strokes of a child performing a task he'd been assigned and hadn't yet decided to resent. Soraya was at the third wagon, her back to him, lifting a crate of ironwork into the cargo bed. The crate weighed at least 80 pounds. She handled it the way she handled everything, with the precise, unhurried competence of a person who had been doing this work long enough that her body performed it independently while her mind occupied itself elsewhere. Keth saw Davin first. She was sitting on the wagon's front bench, mending a leather strap, and her eyes tracked his approach with the particular attention of someone who had been expecting this visit and had opinions about it. "Soraya," Keth said. "Busy. The wheelwright is here." Soraya set the crate down. Not in the wagon, on the ground, beside her feet. The placement was deliberate. The crate in the wagon meant she was loading, which meant she was leaving, which meant the conversation would happen under the pressure of a departure schedule. The crate on the ground meant she had stopped loading. The stopping was its own statement. She turned around. Davin stood 10 feet away. He was wearing the same clothes he wore every day. The work shirt, the leather apron he hadn't removed, the boots still carrying dust from the workshop floor. He had not changed. He had not prepared. He had closed the shop and ridden 4 miles, and he was standing in an orc trade camp in a leather apron because the decision had not included a wardrobe consultation. I made a mistake, he said. Soraya looked at him. The amber eyes held the particular stillness that she deployed when she was listening. Not the social performance of listening that humans often engaged in, but the actual, full body, nothing else exists while this is happening, listening that was as much a physical act as a mental one. You told me to decide whether Fern was safer with you or without you, Davin continued. I decided without you because I was scared. Not of you, not of what we are. Of a 60-year-old woman who thinks that normal is something you can enforce and that my daughter's happiness is less important than the town's comfort. He paused. The camp sounds filled the gap. The river, the horses, the distant murmur of traders settling in for the evening. Fern is not safer without you. Fern is smaller without you. She ties knots that don't hold and draws straps that catch nothing and asks me every day when you're coming back. And I don't have an answer because I sent you away. Soraya did not move. Her body held the same position, square, still, arms at her sides, but something behind her expression was working. The internal recalculation of a person whose defenses had been organized around the assumption that this conversation would not happen and who was now reorganizing them in real time. Keth said orc women don't come back twice, Davin said. Keth talks too much. Is she right? Soraya was quiet for a long time. The orange band on the horizon thinned to a line, then disappeared. The camp's cooking fire threw shifting shadows across the wagons. I drove past your workshop yesterday, Soraya said. On the way to the market, I slowed down. I looked at the yard. The wheel frame is still on the sawhorses. The fence post still has Fern's cord on it. You drove past. I didn't stop. But you slowed down. I slowed down. Keth, from the wagon bench, without looking up from her leatherwork. She drove past 3 times. I counted. Soraya's skin darkened at the cheeks. Keth, 3 times in one day, she also rewound the cord that Fern left on her toolkit. She thinks I didn't see that. I saw it. Davin looked at Soraya. Soraya was looking at the ground. The ground was neutral territory. It didn't blush. It didn't drive past anyone's workshop 3 times. It didn't rewind a child's practice cord and pretend it hadn't. You're not broken, Davin said. On the road, that first night, you asked me if I fix people. I said only wheels. But you're not broken, Soraya. You're the one who does the fixing. The wagon, the cargo, the route, the knots. You fix things, same as me. Soraya looked up. The amber eyes caught the firelight. You said people are more complicated than wheels. They are. Am I complicated? You drive past my workshop 3 times and pretend you didn't. You're extremely complicated. The corner of her mouth moved. Not the full expression, the preliminary motion, the geological shift that preceded the actual event. But it moved. Come back, Davin said. Not for the pin, not for the wagon, for Fern, for the knots, for the thing where we work in the same room and don't talk, and it's the best part of my week. Your daughter's grandmother will. My daughter's grandmother can take her objections to the magistrate or to the river or to anywhere she likes. My daughter asked me why you stopped coming. I didn't have an answer. I'd like to have one now. Soraya looked at him. She looked at Keth, who was aggressively not looking at them, her awl punching through leather with a focus that was transparently performative. She looked at the crate on the ground, the crate she had set down when she turned around, the physical evidence of a departure that had been paused. She picked up the crate. She set it back in the wagon. Then she picked up a second crate and set it beside the first. She was loading. She was continuing the work she had been doing when he arrived. I have a delivery in Ashford tomorrow morning, she said, not looking at him. Early, I'll need to check the wagon's rear axle before the road. I open the workshop at dawn. I'll be there at dawn. Fern wakes up at dawn. I know. Kath bit through her leather thread with her teeth and spat the end onto the ground. About time, she muttered. Soraya arrived at the workshop at dawn. Fern was in the doorway, barefoot, still in her nightdress, holding the knotted practice cord. Soraya. The child launched from the doorstep like something fired from a siege engine. Small, fast, absolutely committed to the trajectory. She hit Soraya at knee level and wrapped her arms around the orc woman's leg with a grip that significantly exceeded what her body mass should have been able to produce. Soraya looked down at the child attached to her leg. Fern looked up at the orc woman attached to her world. I practiced the knot, Fern said, every day. Look. She held up the cord. The knot was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. The 3 loops were present. The twist was in approximately the right location. The tail was tucked rather than dangling. But the tension was uneven and the release mechanism wouldn't function. Close, Soraya said. Close means almost right. Close means you kept trying. I kept trying because you said we'd practice. You said. I'm here. Are you going to keep coming? Soraya looked at Davin, who was standing at the forge, holding a piece of iron stock he'd forgotten he was holding, watching his daughter negotiate the terms of a relationship with the directness that adults envied and could not replicate. I'm going to keep coming, Soraya said. Fern released Soraya's leg, took her hand, and pulled her toward the yard. Come on, I want to show you the trap I made. It caught a beetle. The weeks resumed. Soraya came every week. Keth came every third. The workshop returned to the populated silence that Davin had been missing, the forge ringing, the leather creaking, 2 people working in the same space with the specific, calibrated harmony of professionals who had found in each other the thing they couldn't find alone. Fern's knots improved. By the 4th session, she could tie the 3-loop cargo binding without assistance. By the 6th, she was teaching it to Mrs. Calloway's grandson, who had come to the workshop to have a wheel rim fitted on his handcart and had left with a new skill and a profound respect for a 6-year-old's teaching methodology. Marta Calloway came back once. She stood at the workshop gate and watched Soraya teaching Fern to splice rope. Orc technique, the strands woven rather than twisted, stronger and more weather-resistant than the human method. Fern was concentrating with the full-body intensity that children apply to tasks that matter. Her tongue between her teeth, her small fingers working the strands, under Soraya's patient guidance. Marta watched for 2 minutes, then she left without speaking. She did not go to the magistrate, she did not return. Davin never knew whether she had seen what he had been seeing for weeks, the specific, irreplaceable quality of a child being taught by someone who cared enough to correct her mistakes without diminishing her effort, or whether she had simply performed the calculation that border town grandmothers eventually perform, that the happiness of a living child outweighs the opinions of a dead one's memory, and that the shape of a family is not something you get to choose for someone else. Either way, the objection was withdrawn. Not formally, not with an announcement. It simply stopped. The way weather changes. The town adjusted, slowly the way towns adjust, not with a collective decision, but with a gradual incremental erosion of discomfort through exposure. Soraya became a fixture at the workshop. Keth became a fixture at the tavern. The orc wagon parked in the yard became a thing people walked past without comment. An elderly neighbor nodded at Soraya one morning, a single downward motion of the head, the minimum viable gesture of acknowledgement. Not friendship, not warmth, recognition, the confirmation that a person exists in your field of vision and that their existence does not require you to act. It was enough. In a border town, it was everything. Davin found the chisel on a Monday morning. He had opened the workshop at dawn, started the forge, and reached for his tool roll on the secondary workbench, the bench beneath the shelf he had repaired. The shelf that now held its weight on 2 iron brackets and 1 bone pin that Soraya had driven into the wall months ago. The tool roll was heavier than usual. He unrolled it and found, nested between his iron files and his claw hammer, an implement that did not belong to him. A bone chisel, elk-antler blade, dark leather handle, the edge honed to a sharpness that his iron tools couldn't achieve. Or craftsmanship, the same type of tool Soraya had used on the road that first night, the tool she had handed him in the rain, the tool her father had made. This was not her father's chisel. This was new. The leather was fresh, the blade was unmarked. Someone had made it recently, specifically, deliberately. Beside it, tucked into the roll, was a small piece of cured leather. On it, in orc script, the angular, knife-cut characters that Davin could not read, a single line of text. He held the leather scrap up to the forge light. The characters were neat, carefully inscribed, the work of a person who had taken time with the writing because the words mattered. He waited until Soraya arrived. She was in the yard, checking the wagon's rear axle, a genuine maintenance task this time, not a pretext, when he walked out holding the leather scrap. What does this say? Soraya looked at the scrap. Her expression didn't change. The professional neutrality of a person who had planted something and was waiting to see if it took root. New tool for the wheelwright's eye, she said. That's the translation? Approximate. Orcish doesn't translate cleanly. What's the precise version? The hand that sees broken things. Davin looked at the chisel. He looked at the scrap. His own words, the words he had said to Soraya on the road that first night, the throwaway line about a wheelwright's compulsion, the sentence he had delivered as a casual explanation and that she had apparently received as something else entirely, had been translated into Orcish, inscribed on leather, and returned to him as a tool. His language, in her alphabet, given back as something he could hold. Soraya, it's a tool. Use it. This is more than a tool. Everything is more than what it is. A wagon is a dead man's gift, a knot is a child's promise, a bone pin is a shelf that doesn't fall. She looked at him. The amber eyes were steady. A chisel is a word in a language you don't speak yet, but you will. Davin placed the chisel in his tool roll, in the position next to his best iron file, the position reserved for the tool he reached for first, the one his hand knew by touch, the one that had become part of the unconscious vocabulary of his craft. He went back to work, Soraya went back to the axle. Fern came out of the house carrying a cord and announced to the yard that she had invented a new knot that was better than all previous knots, and that she required an audience immediately. The forge burned, the hammer rang, the rain started, light at first, then steady. The same kind of rain that had been falling on the night Davin found two orc women on a dark road with a broken wheel and a dead man's wagon and a bone chisel that would eventually find its way into his tool roll and sit beside his iron files and become, without ceremony or announcement, part of the equipment. He worked in the rain. He had always worked in the rain. The difference was that now, when the water hit the forge and turned to steam, there was someone in the yard who heard it too, and the hearing was shared, and the sharing was the whole point. The rain fell on the workshop and the wagon and the fence post where Fern's cord hung, and the bone pin in the wall that held the shelf that held the tools, that built the wheels that carried the cargo that connected two people who had met on a dark road because one of them couldn't pass a broken thing without stopping. The chisel sat in the tool roll. The word on the leather said, "The hand that sees broken things." It was, Davin decided, the most accurate description of himself he had ever received. And it had come from a language he didn't speak. Written by a woman whose father built wagons and whose teeth stuck out and whose silence was the best sound in his workshop. Delivered as a tool because that was how both of them understood love. Not as a word, but as something you could hold in your hand and use to fix things. A bone chisel in a tool roll, an orc word on a piece of leather, the hand that sees broken things. His words, her alphabet, given back as something he could hold. He fixed her father's wagon in the rain. She gave him a language for what he already was. If you want more stories from the place where orc and human meet, break down, and fix each other, subscribe to Orc Girl Meets Human and ring that bell. Every notification is a bone pin in a wall that holds. And tell me in the comments, the rain, the bone pin, cool teeth, the silence, the knots, orc women don't come back twice, the broken shelf, 3 drive-bys, or the hand that sees broken things. Which moment was yours? Drop your city. Written for the Orc Girl Meets Human community. For wheelwrights and orc traders and 6-year-olds who tie bad knots and keep trying. And for everyone who knows that the best love stories start with a broken wheel and a stranger who couldn't drive past.